Hi there and welcome back. This is Lauren Kimball for ANI 245, and in this tutorial we are going to address the ball rolling part of your exercise 1. Now before we get started, there's a few things that we're going to need to do to our Maya interface, to kind of prepare for animating. So by default, I'm in my Maya Classic workspace. So you see up here in the upper right hand corner the drop down menu for setting your workspace. I'm in Maya Classic. I'm going to go ahead, and if you have been playing with your workspace, you can go ahead and reset the current workspace. I'm already in the default layout, so it's not going to let me reset it, but that way we're all working from the same blank slate. All right, so that's the first thing I'm going to do. Second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to access my graph editor. So the graph editor is going to be your best friend during this class. It is the tool that allows you to manipulate animation curves, which, if you read the PowerPoint, you already know what an animation curve is. So I'm not going to explain it here. All right, I'm going to go over here to the Windows tab, and I'm going to go down to Animation Editors, and I'm going to click on the Graph Editor. And there it is. Now you could just leave it as a floating window. If you have multiple screens, you could drag it off to the other side. When I'm working on an animated scene, I usually put this on a separate monitor. However, I'm recording on one screen, so I'm going to dock this instead. So I'm going to click on Graph Editor, and I'm just going to hover it right above my timeline, and I'm going to let go. And now I have the Graph Editor docked inside of Maya so that I kind of have some control over this, how the space is being used. Instead of having to constantly minimize and bring back the Graph Editor, I can just click on the little Graph Editor tab, and it's just far more expedient than having to go down here to my main dock to access it. So that's the first thing I'm going to do, is just make the Graph Editor readily accessible. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tweak my timeline preferences and my animation preferences before we get started. So what I need you to do is go to the bottom right hand corner of your screen. Now typically you're going to see this little box that's got a semicolon. That is your script editor. We don't want that. Right above it is the orange guy, running for his life from this flying gear. That's your animation preferences option, so click on that, and it's going to open up this window here. It may look a little different if you're on a PC. I'm on a Mac, but generally speaking, all the settings are the same. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on Restore to Default Settings, and when I do that, it activated my attribute editors to my channel box. It's kind of funny. But really what it did is it went in and it reset all my preferences back to their defaults so that you and I are working from the same point of reference. All right? So the time slider by default is set to play every frame, which is a playback speed that isn't ideal for animation. If you were to start animating and playing back your scene, it would come back really, really fast, which is strange. We're like, why is everything I animate playing so fast? And that's because play every frame is not, it's not the standard. It's not what you typically animate in. What you want to animate in is 24 frames per second. So you know how there's different playback rates depending on what you're working in. So if you're NTSC, which is North America Standard, you're going to have a final export that has been stretched out to 29.97 frames a second. If you work in Europe, you're going to be working in PAL, which is 25 frames per second. Standard film is 24 frames, but play every frame is designed for dynamics. So if you were doing a dynamic simulation, Maya needs more information than just 24 frames in order to calculate that, which is why the playback speed is set to play every frame. So we're going to click on that. I'm going to click 24 frames times 1. And that is what the playback speed should be. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and click on animation. Now there's a lot of options here. We're not going to mess with a ton of these. I want you to go down to tangents. Now by default, it's got this default auto tangent, which is fine. But for the sake of our lesson, I want you to change the out tangent. See how it says default out tangent? Click on this and click on stepped. Now, some of these words are going to be familiar with you because you watched that PowerPoint. You went through that PowerPoint, so you know the stepped tangent is referring to, the flat tangent, the linear tangent. Spline, clamped, plateau, and these auto spans, these are all variations of these basic handles of stepped, linear, and flat. So I didn't really need to go into these other types of tangents. We can in class, but for right now, I want you to just click on stepped. All right? So just in review, under the time slider, I want you to change playback speed to 24 frames per second. Under animation, I want you to change your out tangent to stepped and click save. All right, now we're ready to animate. So in the last tutorial, I showed you how to put together your project folder and how to plug in all your assets. So by default, if you're stepping into this tutorial after just completing the previous tutorial, then you can just click on File, Open, and it will immediately take you to your exercise 1 scene. However, if you were working on something else, like maybe you're in ANI 150 right now, well, you can make sure to set your project window by going to File, Set Project, and finding that exercise 1 directory and clicking Set. That way Maya knows where to find everything. Always important. Great habit to keep up with. All right, so now I'm going to go to File, Open Scene, and I'm going to click on Ball, Roll, Start, Open. I need to save the default scene. There we go. All right, so what I'm going to do to get started is take a quick look at our ball here. So there are, in this scene, we have a polygon plane with an arrow on it just to show you the direction you want to roll the ball. If you don't see that arrow, it might be that you're just in shaded view, which is the 5 key. If you click on 6, you should see that arrow. If you still don't see that arrow, did you put this arrow in the right folder, in the Dropboxes, or not the Dropbox, I'm sorry, in your project directory's source image folder? Because if it's not there, Maya doesn't know how to find it. So very important, set your folder, make sure everything is plugged in where it needs to be plugged in. If you still can't get it to work, it's not the end of the world. I just put that arrow in as sort of a helpful thing. You don't really need it for this assignment. All right, so we know we got this plane here, and we know we got this ball over here. Let's take a look at it. We've got a ball with 3 controllers. We've got, well, actually, let's see if we can't just take this image plane for a minute, or not image plane, polygon plane. We're just going to turn off its visibility for a moment so we can focus on this ball, because for many of you, this is your first time looking at an animation rig. And it looks just like any other sphere, except there are these 3 NURB curves kind of floating around it. The middle one is the main controller. When you grab it, you're able to move the ball wherever you need to. You can also rotate the ball. Standard commands. The top controller allows you to move and squash and stretch the ball. So it gives you some really fun flexibility. And as you can imagine, the bottom controller does the same thing. Now this is a very simple rig. It only has these 3 controllers. It's meant for learning. It's not very fancy. The other rigs, as we progress through the program, are going to become more and more complex. But for right now, this very simple rig, 3 controllers controlling the mesh. You don't click on the mesh to keyframe. So don't grab the mesh. Only select the controllers when you are animating. If you're unsure or you're afraid of selecting the ball, you can put things in a layer. So over here, I already have an objects layer, a controls layer. If I click off the object, we can see that the polygon disappears. The third box over, you can click that twice until there's an R. Now, no matter what you do, you can't click that polygon mesh. Super helpful. All right, so let's summon our polygon plane back. I'm going to go in my outliner. And let's see, there it is, P plane. Go over to my channel box. If you don't see your channel box, press Control A, and you'll see there's your attribute editor, there's your channel box. Attribute editor, channel box, Control A. All right, turn on the visibility, and there is our polygon plane. Now you'll notice you're not able to select it again, and that's because this is also in the objects layer, so you don't have to worry about it. The only thing we can select are the control curves. Yay! Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my outliner. It's this 4th button here. If I click it, it hides. Very good. And I'm going to go ahead and click on the main control of the ball. I'm going to make sure I'm on frame 1, and I'm going to press the hotkey S. Now, the moment I did that, something changed. Some of you might have caught it, but if you didn't, look at the right side of my screen. The main controller in the channel box shows that everything turned red. So I'm going to press Control Z to undo. So this is how it looks when you first select it. When you have that main controller and you press S, everything goes red. What does that mean? Red indicates keyframes, that you have keyed something, that you have recorded it in the timeline. In fact, if we look at the timeline over here on frame 1, there's a little red line that indicates that we have recorded our information on that frame. This position, the translation, the rotation, the scale, and the visibility have all been keyed to frame 1. Now I'm going to go to the end of my timeline, which appears to be frame 36. I'm going to grab the red arrow, the x-axis, and I'm going to drag the ball all the way to the end, and I'm going to press S again. Now, as you can see, there are now 2 tick marks, and when I scroll in my timeline, they snap back and forth because we set our scene to stepped key. And if you followed the PowerPoint, you know that stepped keys turn off interpolation. Interpolation is when Maya generates the animation curves for you. So now that we have what are essentially our key poses, remember in 2D animation and in the PowerPoint, there is pose-to-pose animation where you figure out your poses beforehand. This is the first pose, this is the last pose, okay? So now that I've got it set, I'm going to access my graph editor, and you will see all the channels that I've keyed. Of course, you'll also note that if I click on these different channels, Translate X, you see one point here and another point way up here. But on Translate Y, it's a flat line. Z, it's a flat line. Rotate, everything is flat. When you see a flat line and there's like no step, no variation, meaning all the keys are in a flat line, they're not changing in value, what you are looking at is a static channel. Okay? So let's talk about the graph editor a little bit so we can explain what we're looking at and why static channels are, a bit of a pain. So, when you are in the graph editor, by the way, you can zoom in and out and move it around just like you would up here just by clicking on, for the Mac it's Option, I think it's Alt on PC. You can right click to zoom in and out. You can middle mouse click in order to translate. You obviously can't rotate because it's a 2D space. All right, you can also press F, which will bring everything into focus. Now, everything on the vertical side here, this represents values. Okay, so if I go to Translate X, because remember, we move this on the x-axis, right? We know it's the X because of the red arrow, or over here you can see the little red compass that says X. I mean, it doesn't matter ultimately if you know which channel you animated, you can just see where the variation occurred. So if I look at Y, I clearly didn't do anything on Y. The value never changes. It stays in this position. But on the X, I see this is where I started and this is where I ended up. Boom to boom, okay? So this represents a change in value. As this point goes up and down, it represents how the movement is recorded here. If I grab this keyframe and I middle mouse click it, look at that. I'm moving it in my graph editor and it's causing the ball to move in my scene. So I'm just going to press undo because I don't really want that to move. Just want to demonstrate what's happening. Now, up and down is a change in value. Left to right is a change in time. So over time, at frame 1, this position is held. So see how it's all flatlined? It's held until it isn't. Okay, cool. So this is not a flat channel because there's a variation in the keys. Y, that's a flat channel. Think of like, it's kind of morbid, but somebody flatlining at a hospital, the heartbeat isn't happening. That's kind of what's happened to this channel. And the reason static channels are annoying is because with static channels, they just create a lot of stuff to look at. Look at all this stuff clogging up our graph editor. What can we do about it? I'm going to go up here and go Edit, and I'm going to click on, oh, I don't see it here. Let's instead go up here to this Edit. Instead of in the graph editor, let's go up here. Edit, delete by type, static channels. Again, that's edit, delete by type, static channels. Click. Now, I'm going to show you how to create a button for that to expedite things in the future, but for this lesson, let's just focus on the basics. So when I deleted static channels, everything that was static, everything that had keys that weren't doing anything have disappeared. And now would you look at that, that is so much easier to work with. We're only working with one curve instead of, what is this, 10 curves. All right? So what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and change this so that it's interpolating. So remember from our PowerPoint, interpolating means that Maya is doing the busy work of in-betweening. So I'm going to highlight both of these and I'm going to apply a different type of interpolation, a different tangent type. So over here, we've got all these buttons within the graph editor. I'm not worried about most of them. For this lesson, I'm really focused in here. So from the letter A all the way out to this little plateau area here. These all represent different animation curves you can apply. We're not going to play with most of these curves. We're mostly focusing on the basics because the basics are what this class is about right now at this moment. So this one right here, you see how it's highlighted in blue? That's stepped keys. So you see how it looks like a little stair? You can also always hover over any of these and you'll see the tangent type the button represents. To the left of that is flat tangents. To the left of that is linear. So I'm going to click on linear and wow, something happened. The curve changed. Instead of being a stepped key, it is now a linear key. Now if you remember this from the PowerPoint, when I press play, we have a ball that is moving in a straight line. Doesn't really move very realistically, does it? Because in reality, we'd be dealing with something gaining momentum or losing momentum. Energy is not going to move at a constant like this. So I'm going to go ahead and press stop. So what do I want to do with this animation? I think for me, I want it to start out fast and then slow down. All right, so we have both these tangents selected. Let's click on flat and see what happens. Look at when I click flat how the curve is now, well, curvy. Let's see what happens when I press play. Okay, that's interesting. It speeds up and slows down. Like it like gains momentum, it eases out, and then it eases in. All right, so that's still not quite what I want. I want it to start out fast and roll to a stop. So I'm going to click on this first tangent here, just this one key. See the handle, see how it lays flat? And I'm going to ask it to be linear. So notice that the handle is now linear, meaning that it wants to make a straight line, where this one over here is flat. So when I rewind my animation and press play, it kind of comes to a stop. Now I really feel like this could be exaggerated, and this is where we get into weighted tangents. These are set by default to just, standard. They both are affecting the curve this much by the length of the tangent handles, okay? I want to essentially unlock the weight of the tangent handle. And to do that, so under curves, we've got non-weighted tangents and weighted tangents. I want to click on weighted tangent, and there it changes dramatically. Okay, so over here to the left, we now see actually it applied to both of these, which is kind of unfortunate, but that's okay, not the end of the world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this first tangent handle, and I'm going to ask it to just kind of mellow out. I can grab this, I can grab just the handle edge, middle mouse click it, and I'm just going to try to keep it straight, just keep it the way it was. Over here, I want this tangent handle to have way more emphasis. I'll hold down shift so it stays flat. I'm just going to stretch it out and maybe grab this one and ask it to be linear again so it straightened itself out. There we go. So I got to kind of eyeball it. I want to try to keep this as straight as possible. And then it sort of goes linear and then comes to a slow stop. Now, a couple of things I want you to notice. The first thing I want you to notice is that when you move one side of a weighted tangent, it affects the other side. And we're going to talk about that next week when we get into unlocking these tangent handles so that you have they're not unified. Instead, you're able to manipulate one side over another. But for right now, it's just something to kind of be aware of. All right, so let's see what happened with this animation. Ooh, there we go. Starts out fast and comes to a stop. Perfection. All right, so I'm happy with this. Next, I want to go ahead and animate some rotation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewind to the very beginning, and I want to animate the rotation channel. Now, by default, I could press S, but instead, I'm going to press Shift E. Now notice when I clicked Shift E, all of the rotation channels were keyed. All right, so if you have previous experience in Maya, you know that you can toggle the different tools with W, E, R, and Q. Q is select. So if I grab up this handle here and I click Q, it's just the select tool, as you can see highlighted here in the toolbar. If I press W, it selects the move tool, E is rotate, R is scale. If I press Shift E, it's going to key only the rotation channels. Okay, so now I got to think about how I want this ball to move. So if the ball is rolling, I know that it's going to roll forward. So let's go to the very end of our timeline and let's just rotate it a few times forward. 1, 2, 3, and Shift E. All right, so now I can see that my rotate X, static channel, Y, Z. So I rotated on the Z axis. Cool. I can go over here, edit, delete by type, static channels, and in a later tutorial I'll show you a couple shortcuts for making that more expedient. But for right now, just focus on doing that. Alright, so now that I've got this, I want to go ahead and click on my main controller, press F, and I can see both of my channels. Cool. There's the translate Y, there's the rotate Z. Let's go ahead and grab both these keys and let's make them linear. The first one linear and the last one flattened. There we go. So we got linear and we got flattened. Let's go over here to curves and say, hey, I want non-weighted tangents. Or I'm sorry, I meant weighted tangents. I want weighted tangents to manipulate. If I grab both of my curves, I can kind of see the length of each. And so I'm going to grab this handle and just stretch it. Ooh, I don't want to do that. I just want to grab this. Stretch it out so it matches a little bit more. Okay, cool. Middle mouse click. There we go. So we're just stretching out that handle a little bit so it's a little more prominent. Over here, making sure that stays nice and linear. Maybe straighten it up a little bit. Cool. All right, let's see how that looks in our animation. Let's minimize the graph editor, rewind, press play. And there we go. Our animation is done. Very simple. So with this tutorial, we've been able to learn a little bit about the graph editor. We learned how to set keys. We learned about stepped keys, linear keys, flattened keys. And I mean, some of you who've worked in Maya before are probably thinking, oh, this would be so much easier if we just started with spline, which is basically spline or plateau, very similar. Basically, Maya is sort of figuring out how the curves should look and then refining them. I think it's really important to start here so that you understand exactly what's happening and why it's happening. So that's why it might feel a little bit of a weird way to go about things, but trust me, trust this process. It's really important that you understand this and that everything makes sense and not just take for granted that some things can be automated, okay? So that is it for the ball roll. Our next step with this, I'm going to have you just save it. So to save it, just go File, Save Scene. So it's called Ball Roll Start. So I guess I would just call it Ball Roll End. Doesn't matter. I'm not really going to have you turn in the Maya files for this assignment. You're going to be turning in play blasts, and we'll go over how to make those play blasts next week.